May 1969, Hong Kong. 7 people were in that room. Bruce Lee, his challenger, and 5 witnesses who would never speak of it again. What happened that day was hidden from the public for decades. But what they saw changed how they understood him. The fight wasn't a performance. It wasn't a show of dominance. It was real. It was dangerous. And Bruce Lee never spoke about it. Bruce Lee was still a figure caught between worlds. To some, he was the promising young martial artist making waves in both Hong Kong and America. To others, he was an arrogant outsider, an upstart who had challenged traditional martial arts, too brash for his own good. By 1969, his fame was growing, but his reputation remained controversial. In the world of martial arts, Lee's challenge to established traditions had sparked deep resentment. He was not just another fighter. He was a symbol of change. His approach to martial arts, fusing traditional kung fu with Western boxing and a philosophy of adaptability, unsettled many who saw him as undermining the very foundations of their art. Lee was a product of 2 cultures. Born in San Francisco, raised in Hong Kong, and trained in a blend of Eastern and Western techniques that made him both an outlier and a threat to the traditionalists. The established masters of the martial arts world considered him a nuisance at best, a dangerous rebel at worst. But it wasn't just his ideas that ruffled feathers. It was his physical presence. At 5 feet 7 inches and around 140 pounds, Lee was hardly the typical martial artist. He didn't rely on brute strength. His body was an instrument of extraordinary precision, honed through hours of training. Yet, many dismissed him as an outsider with a flashy style and little real-world grit. Lee's transformation from a young actor to a serious martial artist was driven by a singular need to prove himself. In Hong Kong, he found himself surrounded by practitioners who had years of experience, and in their eyes, he was still the outsider, the film star trying to wear the shoes of a true fighter. His bold statements, his unconventional methods, and his desire to bring martial arts into the modern world made him an easy target for mockery and critique. But that didn't stop him. Bruce Lee had something to prove, not just to the martial arts world, but to himself. He wasn't afraid to face anyone who challenged him. If anything, it fed his desire to be understood not as an actor or a legend in the making, but as a fighter, a man of action. This challenge, a pivotal moment in his journey, was not something he sought for fame or reputation. It was about facing something deeper, the question of who he really was in the face of his own fears and doubts. But before the fight, there was a sense that he was already in danger, not just from the opponent, but from everything that came with being Bruce Lee. His boldness had drawn the eyes of powerful figures, and those eyes weren't always friendly. The challenge would be more than just a test of his martial skills. It would push him into a corner where his entire identity as a fighter would be questioned. Would he be a flash in the pan or something more? John was not the type of person you'd want to meet in a dark alley. He was known in the underground circles as a ruthless enforcer, a 295-pound mountain of muscle with a reputation that preceded him. Standing over 6 feet tall, his presence alone made men step back in fear. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a man who had built his life around physical intimidation, using his massive frame to dominate anyone who came across his path. John had been training in various martial arts since his early teens, and unlike many of his peers, he wasn't interested in the art for its spiritual aspects or its traditions. To him, fighting was simple. You trained to win. It was about destruction, pure and simple. And in his mind, Bruce Lee was someone who had been playing around with techniques that were flashy and impractical, far removed from the raw reality of real-world combat. When John first heard about Lee, he dismissed him as another Hollywood actor dabbling in martial arts. But after hearing about Lee's growing reputation, his curiosity began to shift. Lee was gaining traction not just for his film roles, but for his unconventional approach to martial arts. What John saw in Lee was a challenge to his worldview, a challenge he couldn't ignore. John wasn't looking for publicity, nor was this fight about making a name for himself. His interest in fighting Lee came from a deeper place, a desire to prove, once and for all, that size, strength, and traditional fighting methods would always overpower any modernized style. He wanted to show the world that Lee's precision and fluidity were just a trick of the eyes, a facade that would crumble under pressure. But John wasn't foolish. Despite his bravado, he understood the stakes. He knew that this fight could very well become something more than just a physical confrontation. It could shift the balance of power in martial arts. For years, the traditionalists had laughed at Lee's methods, but John, though skeptical, had heard enough to respect his skills. Still, he was confident that, at the end of the day, a punch from a man his size would be enough to end the show. He wasn't concerned about his own safety. What he did fear, however, was being exposed for what he really was, a man who relied on strength alone, hiding behind his imposing size and brute force. The fight with Bruce Lee wasn't just about the physical exchange. It was a test of the core principles that John had built his entire life on. It was about dominance. And for a man like him, who had spent years in the shadows, this was a way to secure his place in the world of martial arts forever. The moment the challenge was made, there was no turning back. It wasn't a public arena or a formal dojo. It wasn't even a typical martial arts ring. The challenge took place in a sparsely lit industrial warehouse just outside of Kowloon, Hong Kong. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and the cold concrete floor was littered with broken crates and rusted tools. This wasn't the polished environment of a martial arts competition. It was raw, unrefined, just like the fight that was about to unfold. Bruce Lee had arrived first. As always, he was calm, but there was a weight to his movements that day. Something about the atmosphere had shifted. Perhaps it was the isolation of the location or the sheer magnitude of the opponent waiting for him in the shadows. But Bruce's usual serenity was laced with a quiet intensity. His mind was focused not just on the fight ahead, but on the consequences of it. If this went wrong, it wouldn't just be a physical defeat. It could undermine everything he'd worked for, everything he believed in. John arrived later, walking with slow, deliberate steps. His confidence was palpable, a towering presence in the otherwise empty warehouse. The silence between him and Bruce was thick with tension. There were no spectators, only the 5 witnesses who had been handpicked by the challenger. Each was there for different reasons. Some had heard of Lee, some had seen his fight style firsthand, but all were there to witness this clash of titans. The rules of the fight were vague. No refere, no chimilimiches. The only agreement between the two was simple. No weapons, just hand-to-hand combat. There was no mention of a winner or a loser, but the stakes were clear. This wasn't about sport, it was about survival, dominance, and proving a point. The fact that Bruce Lee had agreed to the terms, in a location so far removed from his usual surroundings, spoke to the seriousness of what was about to transpire. The emotional atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating. Bruce, though composed, could feel the weight of the challenge. He knew he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for the integrity of his entire philosophy of martial arts. If he lost, it would not only be a personal defeat. It would validate the critics who believed his style was too unconventional, too Hollywood. But even more, Bruce was battling his own internal fears. What if this fight pushed him too far? What if his instinct for survival went too far, beyond what he could control? What if the power within him, latent and dangerous, was unleashed in a way he couldn't rein in? As Bruce stood across from John, the silence between them seemed to stretch. There was no verbal exchange, no taunts or boasts, just the heavy reality of what was about to unfold. John cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing in the empty warehouse, while Bruce took a slow, deliberate breath. It wasn't fear he was feeling. It was the awareness of the delicate balance between control and chaos that defined every fight he had ever been in. For the witnesses, there was nothing to do but watch. They knew what this meant for Bruce Lee. They knew what was at stake, even if it hadn't yet been revealed to the public. In that moment, each of them understood that this was not a fight for fame. This was a fight for something much deeper. The moment Bruce Lee's foot touched the cold concrete floor, time seemed to contract, pulling everything into a singular focus. John moved first, his size and power dictating the pace. A massive step forward, a clenched fist rocketing toward Bruce's head, the kind of punch that could end a fight with a single blow. The sound of John's fist cutting through the air was deafening, a warning shot that made the warehouse feel smaller, more suffocating. But Bruce didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, his body already anticipating the strike, a reflex that had been honed through years of training, of discipline. As John's fist closed in, Bruce's right foot slid back, just enough to shift his weight, and his left hand, a blur of motion, swept up to intercept the punch, redirecting it with a simple yet precise movement. The collision between Bruce's hand and John's fist was the kind of sound you would never forget, a sharp, clean thwack. But where one man relied on brute force, the other relied on precision and fluidity. The punch that had been meant to crush him was now harmlessly deflected, and in that split second, Bruce was already in motion. John was stunned. The sheer speed with which Bruce had evaded his attack was something he hadn't anticipated. He swung again, this time a wide haymaker aimed at Bruce's torso. But once again, Bruce was already gone. His body shifted, bending and turning in a way that seemed unnatural, yet entirely controlled. In an instant, he had slipped behind John, close enough that the challenger could feel the air shift as Bruce moved past him. Bruce wasn't looking for a perfect hit. Not yet. He was testing, watching, sizing up his opponent, understanding the movements, looking for any sign of weakness. The fight had just begun, but Bruce wasn't fighting just for victory. He was fighting to see how far he could push the limits of control, how close he could come to his own edge without crossing it. John, however, was beginning to realize something. Bruce wasn't just fast, he was everywhere. Every punch, every kick, every feint was like a calculated answer to a question John hadn't even thought to ask. The challenger's immense size, his raw power, was being neutralized with a level of efficiency he couldn't comprehend. John tried to corner him, to trap him, but Bruce was like smoke, there, then gone, always just out of reach. The warehouse was silent except for the sounds of movement, the occasional grunt from John as he tried to land a blow. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. This wasn't the controlled environment of a gym, nor was it the familiar turf where John felt invincible. Here, in this confined space, it felt different, dangerous. The atmosphere seemed to close in around him, and the more he tried to hit, the more frustrated he became. Bruce Lee was not just outclassing him in speed. He was outmaneuvering his mind, slipping into his head with every move. And then, suddenly, Bruce was there again. A quick jab to John's ribs, too fast for the enforcer to block. The impact was solid, the force enough to momentarily wind him. Bruce didn't stay long. He flowed back into his stance, waiting, watching, observing the damage, waiting for John to recover, to make the next mistake. But John didn't seem to know how to recover. His movements were slower now, heavier, more predictable. The punch he threw next came with all the fury of a man who knew he was losing control. Bruce saw it coming from a mile away. With a swift duck, Bruce evaded the strike, then launched himself forward, sliding under John's guard like a blade through soft wood. He didn't go for a knockout punch. He didn't need to. Instead, Bruce's knee shot up into John's stomach, the force of the strike pushing the air out of the enforcer's lungs. The impact was enough to cause John to stagger back, gasping for breath. Bruce stepped back, calm, eyes still locked on his opponent. The first exchange was over, and it had been a statement. The warehouse was silent again. The crowd of 5 witnesses, who had been watching in near disbelief, exchanged glances. They knew this was only the beginning. They didn't know how it would end, but they knew something had shifted. There was no longer a question of whether Bruce could fight. There was only the question of whether John could survive this. The fight had turned, and with it, the atmosphere in the warehouse shifted. There was no longer a sense of playful sparring, no space for testing one another's limits. It had become raw, dangerous, and personal. John, the giant who had once thought of Bruce Lee as little more than a nuisance, now found himself fighting not just for victory, but for his survival. John's breaths were labored, his movements sluggish. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the dirt and grime of the warehouse floor. His hands, once capable of crushing a man's skull with a single blow, were now trembling. He knew he had been outclassed in speed, in precision, but what he hadn't expected was the sheer psychological pressure Bruce was applying. Every move was a reminder of how out of control John truly was. Bruce wasn't just faster, he was playing with him, drawing out his weaknesses, forcing him to make mistakes. John's fist swung again, more desperately now. But it was wide, slow, a predictable arc that Bruce had already seen a dozen times. This time, Bruce didn't just evade. He closed the distance, striking with the speed of a striking serpent. His fist hammered into John's ribs again, this time with the intent to damage. John gasped, a sharp intake of air that couldn't fill his lungs. He staggered, but his feet never left the ground. Bruce saw the moment clearly. John was close to breaking. His once confident frame was now slumped, hunched, a shadow of the man who had entered this fight with arrogance. But there was a choice here, one that had never been more urgent. Bruce could finish it, land the strike that would end this fight, and possibly his opponent's career, maybe even his life. But if he did, what would that mean for him? What would it mean for the philosophy he had spent so long crafting? For a brief moment, Bruce hesitated. He had pushed his body to its limits before. He had been in fights where he had unleashed his full potential without remorse. But this was different. This man wasn't just an opponent. He was a mirror, a reflection of Bruce's own fears, his doubts. John wasn't a symbol of strength to conquer. He was a representation of something Bruce had always feared, that deep well of violence inside him that, once tapped, could swallow everything. The witnesses were silent, watching the exchange unfold with a mix of awe and disbelief. They could see the tension in Bruce's face, his body coiled, ready to act, but there was a stillness in his eyes that told a different story. Bruce Lee, the man known for his strength and precision, was now grappling with something much deeper than physical control. He was grappling with the morality of his own power. John, still reeling, let out a guttural roar, trying to muster one last attempt at a punch. His hand swung forward like a wrecking ball, a desperate act, fueled by pride more than any real strategy. But Bruce wasn't there. In the blink of an eye, he slid behind John, wrapping his arm around his massive frame in a technique so precise it looked effortless. Bruce wasn't looking to hurt him anymore. The tension in his muscles was the kind of control that only years of discipline could bring. His fingers pressed into the pressure points of John's body, a subtle but deliberate act of restraint. The giant enforcer's breath hitched in his throat as his body froze in place, caught in the precision of Lee's grip. It wasn't a move meant to destroy. It was a move meant to contain. Bruce's face softened just for a second. There was no rage, no overwhelming desire to inflict more pain. He was calm, almost as if the act of holding John in place had released something from within him. The violence was over. The fight, at least in its physical sense, was done. But the emotional weight still lingered. Bruce stood behind John, feeling the power of his own body pressed against the other man's, feeling how close he had come to losing control. He had made the right decision, the moral one, but that didn't mean it didn't feel like a cost. Bruce wasn't just a man who fought. He was a man who carried the responsibility of his actions and the burden of knowing how close he was to crossing a line he couldn't come back from. John, breathless and shaking, finally dropped to his knees. His pride was broken, his body defeated. The challenger had been humbled, not by brute force, but by the calm precision of Bruce Lee's control. Bruce stepped back, allowing John to regain his footing, his composure. He didn't speak. There were no words, no taunts, just the silence that followed the storm. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was a test of will, a moment where the fight became something deeper than physical dominance. For Bruce, the moral choice he had made was a reminder that true strength wasn't just in the body. It was in the restraint to know when to stop. The warehouse stood silent, save for the sound of heavy breathing. John, his body battered and bruised, slumped against the concrete floor, still in disbelief. His mind was grappling with what had just transpired. His strength, his experience, everything he had built his identity on had crumbled in the face of Bruce Lee's precision. He was no longer the towering enforcer who struck fear into anyone who crossed him. He was just a man, broken and humbled in a way he never expected. Bruce Lee stood a few feet away, his chest heaving as he wiped the sweat from his brow. There was no triumphant grin, no boastful celebration. His body was tired, but his mind was even more so. He had controlled the fight, controlled his emotions, and controlled the overwhelming power that had surged through him. But the choice to hold back, to avoid pushing John past the breaking point, had left a scar of its own. Bruce knew he could have ended it, could have shattered John's pride, his spirit, and perhaps even his body. But he didn't. That decision, the restraint, would remain with him just as deeply as the physical scars of the fight. The witnesses, 5 men who had been silent observers to the brutal dance of combat, began to stir. None of them had ever seen Bruce Lee fight like this before, calm, deadly, and precise. Some had come to the warehouse expecting a spectacle, a fight between 2 legends. What they witnessed instead was something far more powerful, a man who not only conquered his opponent, but also his own fears and impulses. One of them, a seasoned fighter who had once sparred with Lee, spoke first. His voice was low, almost reverential. "You could have finished him," he said, looking at Bruce with a mix of awe and disbelief. "You had him. You had every chance to end it." Bruce didn't respond at first. He simply looked at John, who was slowly getting to his feet, his face bruised, his pride shattered. He wasn't going to get up and challenge Bruce again. There was no need for further violence. "Sometimes," Bruce said quietly, "the strongest move is to walk away. It's not always about the fight you win. It's about the fight you control." The witnesses didn't speak after that. The message was clear. The aftermath of the fight would echo in Bruce's life for years to come. In the eyes of those who witnessed it, the story of what happened in that warehouse would become one of the unsung legends of Bruce Lee's career, a moment that shaped him as much as any of his public victories. For John, the fight marked the end of his reign as an enforcer. He disappeared from the scene after that day, his reputation never fully recovering from the humiliating defeat. Bruce Lee had taken more from him than just his pride. He had taken the myth, the story that John had built of himself as an unstoppable force. In its place, there was only the image of a man who had been outmatched, not by strength, but by something far more dangerous, control. For Bruce, the fight was a lesson, a reminder of the responsibility that came with his power. He was no longer just a martial artist or a movie star. He was a man who carried the weight of his actions, a man who had learned to navigate the line between violence and restraint, between dominance and compassion. As the witnesses filed out of the warehouse, they would remember that day not for the brutality of the fight, but for the silence that followed. For what Bruce had done wasn't just about winning. It was about understanding the true nature of strength, knowing when to fight, but more importantly, knowing when not to. There would be no grand speeches or dramatic stories told. No, the real story of that day was buried in the quiet aftermath, in the weight of a decision that would resonate for years to come. The strongest man in the room is not the one who wins. It's the one who knows exactly how much damage he chose not to do.